In our first lecture of our Behavioral Sciences lecture series, we are going to talk about how biology and behavior are connected. In general, psychology and the study of the brain anatomy is revolving around neurophysiology, which is the study of how the nervous system and behavior are connected. Usually, this focuses on regions of the brain and how they affect behavior. Now, neurophysiology as a discipline has a very deep and rich history. However, for the MCAT purposes, you will not be required to know specific names or dates. Before we proceed, let's have a discussion on neurons. Neurons are the cells that are the base unit of the nervous system. They are divided into three types. Sensory neurons, or afferent neurons, send signals to the central nervous system. Motor neurons, or efferent neurons, send signals away from the central nervous system. Interneurons act as intermediates between different neurons. Neurons are classified as what direction they travel. Reflex arcs are the ability of interneurons in the spinal cord to relay information to the source of the stimuli while simultaneously routing it to the brain. Let's take a quick look at the neuron and its structure. I'm sure many of you have seen this before, but a neuron looks something a little like this. So up here we've got the cell body with the nucleus on the inside and dendrites that protrude out. A signal will be picked up by these dendrites, processed by the cell body, which will generate an action potential that will travel down this axon to its synaptic terminal. At the synaptic terminal, another neuron will pick up this signal through its dendrites and propagate the signal down its axon to its synaptic terminal. This can go on and on and on. Now, keep in mind that neurons are all or nothing, meaning that a signal will either fire or not fire. The strength of a signal heavily depends on the frequency at which these neurons fire action potentials and how many neurons there are firing. So now that we've talked about the basic unit, let's go on a slightly higher level of organization. The nervous system is divided into two systems. The first one is the central nervous system, or CNS. This includes the brain and spinal cord. So this is where most of the big thinking occurs. Outside of the central nervous system, there exists the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. This includes basically anything that's not in the central nervous system. Now, the peripheral nervous system is divided into two systems as well. There's the somatic, which is the voluntary system. This is the thing that you can control consciously. And the other one is the autonomic, which is under subconscious control. Now, within the autonomic nervous system, there exist two divisions. The first is sympathetic. This is also called the fight or flight, because the sympathetic nervous system accelerates your body functions under stress. The other system is called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is also nicknamed rest and digest. This system is the exact opposite of the sympathetic nervous system. It slows you down and kind of puts you at ease. Here's an overview of the two systems. As you can see, the central nervous system is in the center, going straight down, and all the extensions coming off, so the ganglions and the nerves, are called the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so now that we have general organizations of the nervous systems on pat, let's go into subdivisions of the brain. The first subdivision of the brain is the hindbrain. This controls balance, motor coordination, breathing, digestion, and general arousal processes like sleeping and waking. It also manages the vital functions needed for survival. It includes the cerebellum, the medulla oblongata, and reticular formation. Think of this as the underlying mechanism that keeps all of your functions going. It would be really difficult for you to get anything else done if you had to constantly think about breathing, keeping your heart rate going, and managing your internal temperature. So, in a sense, it's a blessing that we have a hindbrain that takes care of all of that for us. The next subdivision is the midbrain. This is almost directly in the center of the brain, just like how the name suggests. This receives sensory and motor information from the rest of the body. It also is associated with involuntary reflex responses triggered by stimulus. So, treat this as sort of a central area that controls a lot of your reflexes. So every time you move or flinch or any of those sorts of things, that is based largely on the midbrain. Last but not least, we have the forebrain. This is associated with complex perceptual, cognitive, and behavioral processes. Although this is not necessary for survival, it grants us the capacities that characterize us as human. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of some of the early psychological surgeries, but one of them was removing the forebrain. Now, people that had their forebrains removed were basically vegetative. They lost pretty much any concept of personality or thought that most of us would consider normal. Now, I'm sure you're all asking this question right now, but how did we get to know all of these things? Let's go into that a little bit. There are several ways to study the brain, and 3 of them are going to be tested on the MCAT. One is brain lesions. The way brain lesions work is you basically observe how animals or humans with damage in their brain are affected. In certain instances, you will actually purposefully damage areas to see what effect it has on their personality or behavior. The next one is the electroencephalogram, or EEG. This measures electrical activity in the brain with electrodes. If you've seen an EEG before, it looks something like this. So it basically measures signal, and you have this sort of rise and fall, peak-like structure that goes on and on and on, and you'll see row after row after row of these. The last one is regional cerebral blood flow. This measures brain activity by seeing the changes in blood flow to parts of the brain. Now, be mindful, however, that this relies on the premise that an increase in blood flow also is related to an increase in activity. So, we mentioned this at the end of our subdivisions of the brain discussion, but let's go ahead and talk about the forebrain just a little bit more. The forebrain is divided into several structures, and let's go into each one in depth. The first one is the thalamus. This is a relay station for sensory information. It's sort of a waypoint for this information to go to other parts of the brain. The next structure is called the hypothalamus. This maintains homeostasis and integrates with the endocrine system. Sort of think of this as the master gland, or the master control center. It sort of regulates how the endocrine system controls your body functions. The basal ganglia is basically an editing station. So think of this as an editor or a producer in a record studio. Your brain sends out a signal or makes a product, and the basal ganglia sort of smooths it out, makes it nice, so that the rest of your body can function properly. Lastly, the limbic system is sort of the emotion and memory control station. It consists of septine nuclei, which are involved with feelings of pleasure and pleasure-seeking behavior. The septine nuclei is generally associated with addiction as well. The amygdala is the source of where fear and aggression come from. And lastly, the hippocampus consolidates memories and communicates with other parts of the limbic system. The cerebral cortex. So this is divided into 4 sections, and let's go ahead and talk about each one in particular. So the frontal section of the cerebral cortex executes executive functions, impulse control, long-term planning, motor function, and speech production. So this is basically where the forebrain is, and this is the function that it has in particular. The parietal lobe involves sensation, touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. It also is associated with spatial processing, orientation, and manipulation. The occipital lobe at the very back is associated with visual processing. Any sensory information that is sent from your eyes to your brain is processed in this area. Finally, the temporal lobe is involved with sound processing, speech perception, memory, and emotion. Many of the language and communication disorders that we will discuss later in this course have to do with issues with the temporal lobe. I'm sure you've all heard of this before, but the brain is divided into two hemispheres. Before we go into what those hemispheres are and what they do, let's talk briefly about how this communication works. I'm sure some of you are asking, if our brain is split in this fashion, how the heck do we get anything done? Well, there's two forms of communication that our brain employs. The first one is contralateral. This is when the body and the brain communicate on opposite sides. So, if we have a brain here, and it's divided into a side, basically the signals will go across the body. Ipsilateral, on the other hand, is when the brain communicates with the body on the same side. So if we were to draw this out, if this is the brain, signals will go out to both sides, just like that. Now, in general, contralateral communication is more common. Let's go ahead and talk about the hemispheres in particular. Now, I'm sure all of you already have a very good idea of what you are good and not good at, but a lot of those skill sets are heavily associated with one or two hemispheres. Let's go ahead and talk about the right hemisphere first. This one is usually non-dominant, and it's associated with intuition, creativity, music cognition, and spatial processing. This is generally the one that a lot of artsy people like to say is their strong one. The other side is the left hemisphere. This is generally dominant because it associates with language, but it's mostly analytic in function. Most of you science types are going to say this is your stronger area. So we can't really talk about the nervous system unless we talk about neurotransmitters, which are chemicals that are secreted to elicit responses. The first one is acetylcholine. This is used by the somatic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system to move muscles. In the CNS, it's used for alertness. Dopamine maintains smooth movements and steady posture. Also, imbalances in dopamine are also associated with various mental disorders. Endorphins and enkephalins are the natural painkillers. This is generally the hormone that's associated with drug use, because certain drugs will increase endorphin levels or simulate their effects. Epinephrine and norepinephrine. These maintain wakefulness and alertness. They also mediate fight or flight responses. Epinephrine tends to act as a hormone, and norepinephrine acts classically as a neurotransmitter. Both of these are often sort of nicknamed as adrenaline. So if you've had an adrenaline rush, generally what you've actually had is an epinephrine and a norepinephrine rush. Gamma aminobutyric acid, or GABA. This is a brain stabilizer. This is also a hormone that is often targeted by psychotic drugs. Lastly, serotonin modulates mood, sleep patterns, eating patterns, and dreaming. Again, this is also the target of a lot of treatments. So, we've talked about neurotransmitters, but how does the brain affect other systems or elicit responses in other areas of the body? This is done by a connection to the endocrine system and the hormones released by it. Cortisol is a stress hormone which is released by the adrenal cortex. This is generally in high concentrations in high-stress situations. There are a lot of studies to suggest that high levels of cortisol actually affect health very negatively. Testosterone and estrogen. These are sex-based hormones. Now, if you're male, you're going to have a higher level of testosterone, and if you're female, you're going to have a higher level of estrogen. But that's not to say that the other is not present. They mediate libido, sexual activities, and often influence gender-based characteristics. Testosterone in general increases aggressive behavior. It's released by the adrenal cortex and the testes and ovaries, respectively. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are released by the adrenal medulla. They cause physiological changes associated with the sympathetic nervous system. It's clear to see how biology affects our behavior, but why it affects our behavior in such a way, and how it got to be that way, is a debate that we've been having for centuries. This is commonly called the nature versus nurture debate. And it's a comparison regarding the relative contributions of genetics and environment, or nature and nurture, to an individual's traits. Nature talks about the genetics, how you were born, and generally how you are set up, whereas the environment, or nurture, is the circumstance of your upbringing, how you were raised, and the environments that you were exposed to. It's generally understood that both of these play a role. However, the relative effects of each can be studied. Up to this point, it's inconclusive which one is more important. Some studies that have been used to discuss the relative contributions of both are commonly referred to as family studies, twin studies, or adoption studies, just to name a few. These three are ones that you will commonly see on the MCAT. Family studies are comparisons between family members versus the general population. It's a measure to see whether or not there's a trend in behaviors throughout a family of interest. For example, if you wanted to study stubbornness as a trait, you would compare the relative stubbornness between family members of subsequent generations to see if there is a general trend. Twin studies compare concordance rates between identical or paternal twins. Seeing is that twins have identical genetic makeup, any sort of similarity or discrepancy will often point to nature versus nurture. If there's a trend that both twins share, then you can say that there might be a genetic link. If there are trends that are different, then you could probably say that that had to do with some upbringing. Lastly, adoption studies compare similarities and differences between adopted children and their adoptive parents or biological parents. If you notice trends between adopted children and their adoptive parents, you could probably speculate that that has to do with environment, seeing is that almost all the time adopted children are not related to their adopted parents. If there are traits that are similar between adopted children and biological parents, you can probably say that there's a genetic link to that. Now, adopted children generally have little to no contact with their biological parents, so any sort of similarity in characteristics and behavior can only be explained by genetics or nature. So, studies often contribute to our understanding of nature versus nurture, and these are just a couple that illustrate how these are compared. That will conclude our lecture on biology and behavior. As you can see, there is a clear link between our biologies and our behaviors.